Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
This is Michael Waits from ATP Stories. I'm here with Benjamin Joffe. I would introduce you myself and say all the things that you've done, but I don't think it's possible for me to say all the things that you've done and accomplished in time. So maybe you should start just by giving a little bit of self-introduction.
Hi. Hi, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Let's say that. So I'm from France originally, and I moved to Asia in 2000. I moved to Japan initially, and really I was just kind of curious about the region and not really so excited about working in France or in Europe. So I didn't have plans to stay for that long, but eventually one thing leading to another. I've been in Asia since about 17 years now.
Wow.
So I worked in Japan, I worked in South Korea, I worked in Beijing, in Shenzhen, in Hong Kong, a few short stints also in Silicon Valley, Singapore, and Malaysia during that time, and mostly working in technology.
So obviously, because I lived in Japan for 20-something years, I'm really curious. Were you in Tokyo? And if you were, what were you doing there?
Yeah, so I initially moved to Tokyo. I was in Shinjuku, and I was working in a consultancy, researching innovation across different technology sectors, ranging from automotive to telecom. Eventually, I got interested more in telecom because it was really booming. Maybe you were there at the time with iMode. So it was just the year when iMode was taking over. It was kind of a pre-iPhone ecosystem, and I got more interested in telecom. I joined a telco. I worked there for 2 years in intellectual property and market research, and then I basically decided to venture out and start my own consultancy, which I ran for a few years across Japan, Korea, and China.
So what was the telco you were working for in Japan?
Called Orange. So it's a branch of formerly known as France Telecom.
Right, so France Telecom and the Orange business was probably bought by Vodafone, no?
No. Orange is a brand of France Telecom.
Yeah, but then what happened to the brand in Japan? Or was it didn't launch in Japan?
No, the telco was there mostly to research the market and develop technologies. Wasn't really operating in Japan per se.
Yeah, so what did you think when iMode came out?
Well, initially it was all kind of strange and kind of familiar because it takes us even further back in time. But in France, we had this really old system pre-internet called the Minitel, where people could convert online using dedicated small terminals. And I felt that a lot of that was kind of resurrected with the randomness. Like in the early years of iMode, you would text people which had similar mobile number, and you would start to make mobile friends, and everything was what was really interesting is that there was also a lot of services that were developed, including mobile apps and mobile games already from the using Java from around 2001.
Right.
And a lot of it was very similar actually to the Minitel model, and I learned later that they actually had studied the Minitel model for pricing. So that was quite interesting. And I think what I also realized is that innovation really happens everywhere, but ecosystems can be so different that innovation cannot easily migrate from one place to another. So when Docomo tried to export its model, it didn't really work very well because they only could team up with third tier or second tier telcos in other countries. So they couldn't really impose the model. And in a way, iPhone resurrected the model, but with a different balance of power between telcos and handset manufacturers. In Japan, the telcos had all the power, were dictating the specs to the manufacturers, and were controlling the entire ecosystem. But Apple flipped that totally around because of the different balance of power that was happening overseas versus Japan. So I realized innovation happens everywhere, but ecosystem characteristics can make it really difficult to replicate identically. Another thing I realized is that so many people were trying to explain what was going on, and all the explanations were kind of wrong. So when Japanese people started to use their mobiles to text, to play, to take photos. People were saying, "Oh, Japanese like cute things.
Right.
Japanese has more hands. Japanese don't have cars. They commute a lot. They have small apartments." They were giving all sorts of kind of correct descriptions that were not causal.
Right.
Actually, were not the cause of the success. But when you don't understand, you explain with what you have. So it's kind of like probably a human trait that we build causation where there's just correlation or no relation at all because we don't know better.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was quite an interesting learning for me as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was there at the dawn of iMode, and I remember exactly what you're saying, right? This whole concept of, Japanese people do this and they can afford to do this, right? Because phones back then were very expensive in Japan, 70, 80,000 yen, $700-800, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea was, so a Japanese lady graduates from Keio, lives with her parents, gets a job, and has the disposable income, right, to take pictures of Hello Kitty and send them around because they like cute things and because they have all the extra disposable income, they can afford an expensive phone. But this model is not going to work everywhere. And you make a super good point, because I remember back in the early 2000s when Docomo started becoming very successful and powerful in Japan, they did try to expand to other markets and actually bought telcos in other markets with the expectation of expanding iMode, and it didn't work.
Yep.
It just didn't work. You make a great point. And that kind of points to this whole concept of, you can take a gigantic company in China and try to move it into Indonesia, and it's probably not going to work as is. There are some best practices that may be transferable, but maybe not, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it really taught me a lot, because when I saw how some Japanese companies, as you said, like Docomo included, tried to expand, or some mobile content providers, or some game companies tried to expand, they were really planning that basically the future of other markets would be the same as theirs.
Correct.
And in fact, what they realized is that, I don't know if they realized that so clearly,
right.
but that the future is not a linear path that everybody walks. It's not the same road for everyone. Sometimes it intersects, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it's totally different path, and they just stay as is. And that's what in Japan now they call the Galapagos Syndrome, right?
Right.
So it really kind of made me realize that not only innovation is everywhere, but the explanations for innovation are generally difficult to actually understand, and a lot of them are actually related not to what we call culture, but more like ecosystem characteristics. And that led me to try to understand how those ecosystems were working, what would define an ecosystem, because I was asked all the time, how can we grow an ecosystem to be like Silicon Valley?
Right, impossible.
And I was like, but what is Silicon Valley?
Right,
and
what is it?
Yeah, exactly. What is it? Like, how could you describe it? So I broke it down, and I really tried to find what were the sub-elements that would make up an ecosystem, so that not only you could compare yourself, but you could also see if you had strength and if you had things you could actually act upon. Because, if you're Singapore, you're not going to be Silicon Valley ever.
No.
Silicon Valley is a place where you have not only access to a huge market, you have a lot of local talent, you have a lot of access to capital, you have incredible infrastructure, and you have pretty supportive regulations. And if you break that down even further, like if you look at just access to capital, you have angel investors, you had seed funds, you had growth funds, you had lots of companies who can acquire you, you have IPO opportunities. So they have the whole spectrum. So essentially, if you break it down like under each category, you can see what is it you can actually do. You can't change the size of your market. The only way to do that is to change the kind of ambition that people have when they create a company.
Right.
Do they want to be local? Do they want to be regional? Do they want to be like global? Do they want to target the US market? So for example, Israel is kind of a small country, but most companies born in Israel or in Sweden or other like small countries, they never really try to be a local champion. They try to be a global champion. They try to go to US, they try to go global. So it's a question of mindset. So mindset is something you can evolve. Market size, you cannot. Access to capital, you cannot just, summon investors to your ecosystem just because you ask. Money will always find good companies, that I believe. So if you show that you have a good company, it doesn't matter where it is. In fact, these days for investors, it's considered a competitive advantage to not be based in the valley in some cases, because you have much lower costs, higher retention, and a more ease to hire because it's less competitive than in the valley.
Right.
So I'll give an example, like Spotify's company, the founders from Sweden.
Yep.
A lot of the engineers are in Europe, and it's perfect because it's cheaper, it's easier to keep them because there's less competition. Why would they change that? So this is it makes you kind of realize when you start to clarify the components of an ecosystem, you really get to see more clearly what you can change and what you cannot.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I mean, I think I'm older than you, but I remember back in the day when companies like Lotus 123 and EMC and all the companies that were formed along what was then called the Super Information Highway in Boston, right on Route 128. And if anybody's listening that's close to my age, they'll sort of get a tingle when they hear this. And people used to talk about how can we create the ecosystem around this highway, and again, like you said, people come up with reasons to kind of create causality and correlation when in fact they just are facts that not necessarily lead to either the correlation or the causality, right? So people used to talk about, well, Boston has MIT and it has Harvard and it has Tufts and it has Brandeis and it has a whole bunch of really smart people. Boston swells to a city of 500 or 600,000 people, and in the summertime it's back to 200. And I'm just kind of making up those numbers. But people spend a lot of time trying to do research and figure out why that worked, when in reality, you're right. It just turns out that maybe there's a little bit of serendipity in innovation. And then it all moved to Stanford and to Berkeley, and people look at Silicon Valley and San Francisco and say, if you go back to San Francisco just 10 or 15 years ago, it has nothing to do with what it is today. And sure, there were venture capitalists there, but even the VCs were considered like outlier weirdos until 10 years ago. But you can actually go even further back. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, right? But you want to go to like the Renaissance in Europe, and people tried to recreate the environment that was in Florence and the Medicis, and you just can't do it.
Well, in a way you can, if you can, the question is probably how do you prime the pump, right?
Yeah.
And you're right, like today, like let's say you want to study fashion, you would go to Paris, you go to Milan, you go to New York, because that's where the people are. If you want to be surrounded, if you want to study, I listened to a master class by what's his name? Anyway, so on stand-up comedy recently, was saying if you want to learn stand-up comedy, go to a place where you can practice and learn from the best. So go to New York, Montreal. There's not that many cities. Like I live in Hong Kong. There's 2 comedy clubs. Right? It's not like I'm. It means that I'm not a comedian.
I was going to say you're try.
I like to attend comedy, and the problem of the local comedians that they don't have so many outlets to practice their craft.
Right.
So where do you practice your craft? Where are the other craftspeople? And in some cases, you just need one special person or one special company to prime a pump. I think that's what happened in Waterloo with BlackBerry. That's what happened in Finland with the Rovio and Supercell. That basically, they contributed to the ecosystem tremendously. But and then some of it is macroeconomic factors, like why are there tons of VCs and startups today in China? Well, because the GDP of China has grown enormously in the past 15 years, and now they have an infrastructure to actually deliver mobile and web services. I remember visiting India about 4 years ago when the first big internet companies were emerging. So I met with the founders of Flipkart, of Ola Cabs, and a few others, Redbus.
Right.
And I realized, okay, well, these companies, they're actually not just technology companies. They're actually solving infrastructure problems for the country.
Right. They're not trying to piggyback. They're trying to piggyback on what's going on in the internet in the United States. They're saying, oh my God, I have a technology that I can use to solve this problem. And there's been a transportation problem. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
It required more than a website and an app. Like Flipkart had to build a logistics company.
Right.
Ola Cabs had to basically build a taxi company.
Right.
And they had to go to villages to recruit and train drivers. And they had to help them microfinance their car and sell them mobile phones so that they could take orders. So that, they were doing much more than what was appearing on the surface. So and now they're in fantastic positions. But so that's it really makes you realize that you really need to understand profoundly the ecosystems to operate well in them, but that there's also an incredible amount of innovation and opportunities, because the way that Ola Cabs created its company is very suitable for emerging markets, much more so than Uber,
Right.
in fact.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at Uber's success in certain markets, it's not there, right? We can go back and talk about a company like Easy Taxi as well, right? So Easy Taxi was something that was built in Brazil. It was part of Rocket Internet. And everybody, particularly in Southeast Asia, was afraid because back in the day, the Rocket Internet guys were considered the gorillas in the room. And yet they came in with Easy Taxi, lots of funding, if I remember correctly, global funding of $40 million, which back at that time seemed like a lot of money. And yet now there's no Easy Taxi because Grab Taxi did a much better job of scaling and understanding the local market and just disappeared, right? So you're right. That whole concept of innovation moving into a new market at the same way that it grew in its initial market, just not going to happen.
Yeah, so when I was running my consultancy before I moved into hardware investment, which is what I'm doing now, I researched a lot of innovative companies across Asia, mostly Japan, Korea, and China, and I came up with kind of this concept of it's very kind of evolutionary. You have an ecosystem, you put a kind of digital creature, and depending on how the ecosystem works, it has to evolve. And there's so many examples of that. Like Tencent, for example, when they tried to adapt the ICQ model, they couldn't make money with advertising, and they looked around and they looked at Korea. They learned from the microtransaction model. And they started to sell, little mobile services on little icons and that became a suitable business model because they couldn't feed on advertising.
Right.
And there's so many other examples when Alibaba adapted the eBay model and decided to make it free to basically lower the barrier of entry for the Chinese company owners. That's also an adaptation. So there's so many adaptations and evolutions, and that really shows that the initial idea is just like the original ancestor, and that you really need to adapt to the ecosystem to be able to succeed. I have an example. I met many years ago the founder of Meituan. Is one of the biggest internet companies in China now. Mm-hmm. It's basically the local Groupon, except it's about 10 times bigger than Groupon.
Right.
And when I met him, he had just sold a Facebook clone basically for a couple of $1 million because he couldn't make money with ads, and it just didn't work. He was very good at acquiring users, was very good at keeping them, but he couldn't find a way to make money, and he wasn't very connected, not very good at financing, and he couldn't find anybody to finance his company. The company got acquired by Oak Pacific, which was an investment company that was also running some kind of a online community at the time. And they grew. They were very good at financing, and they grew the service, and then that became Renren, and they IPO'd before Facebook as the Facebook of China
Renren,
for over $1 billion.
Right.
So it really shows that it's not only you need to learn a number of skills to operate successfully a company, but you also need a lot of adaptation. So what's interesting is that this guy Wang Xin, when he realized that he was very good at operating but not so creative on a business model and things like that, mm-hmm. he tried a few other things. He tried to replicate a few US successes like FriendFeed, Twitter, and that just didn't work. And then when he saw Groupon, he was like, oh, that's a model that I could make work in China because I charge businesses and I don't try to charge advertising or anything. I just charge businesses very straightforwardly. When they have a sale, I have a cut. And he started operating that. But because the model was so straightforward, he had about 1,000 competitors. And that's where his strengths at execution became really relevant because he basically over-executed everybody.
Right. Because we saw the same dynamic actually in Singapore, right, with all the sort of daily deal sites. And then what was it? Metro deals essentially ended up winning and selling out for a decent thing. But yeah, you're right. So again, and this gets back to something I talk about a lot with founders, is these ideas are out there, right? It's just how you execute these deals in some way, shape, or form. How you execute these businesses is going to be part of the key, not the only key, obviously, to your success. So what else did you go ahead?
Yeah, and when executing is also adapting, because if you're just trying to use the same playbook, it just doesn't work. Like there's very, very few examples of direct adaptations or foreign entrepreneurs doing well in Asia, but that would probably be a different topic. But it's not so easy.
But isn't the old world example of this, and you just made me think about it, right? But isn't the old world example of this of basically Ford coming in as a much stronger partner, coming into Japan and trying to sell cars with, what was it, left-hand drive? You know what I mean? Well, everybody else seems to, you know what I mean? They take exactly what they're doing in the United States, they drop it into Japan and wonder why.
There's a more recent quote from Jack Ma where he says that the reason eBay failed is because they were trying to land jet fighters into rice paddies.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing. So, and again, Japan, same thing. You're trying to sell a Cadillac into a place where only like a Mazda will fit, right? Because the cars were too big. It's the same thing. Like the roads were too small. You couldn't turn into like the side streets, so you couldn't buy the car. You couldn't even get them in there. It's the same idea, I think, is what you're saying. It's just fast forward to today in the digital space. Yep. It's kind of the same thing.
Adapting to the ecosystem, and in some, I mean, in the case consumer products, there's also some adaptation to kind of the culture code. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept of each place. For example, when you sell a car in the US, it's all about freedom, open space. It's like a horse, basically. Whereas when you go to Germany, it's all about the engineering. It's like the machine, right?
Yep.
If you go to Japan, it's about maybe engineering and convenience. So you have to communicate also things that are very different, and you have to sell products that are not the same, essentially.
But this is, so you've actually introduced to me two really interesting concepts. It's going to change the way I think about the development of the companies here. One of them is this sort of, you take a what did you say? It's evolutionary. So you take a digital creature,
species.
You take a digital creature, a digital species, and you kind of drop it in. You don't know where it's gonna end up because it's gonna evolve. That's actually really interesting to me. And then this whole concept that I've been trying to put this into words for a long time and haven't been able to come up with the right terminology for it. But culture code is actually a really great way to describe this concept of, everybody wants a car. And if you ask them why they want it, they'll say, look, I've got to get to work in the morning. And they'll all maybe even say the same thing. But the reality is when they go to make a choice about it, here's where the culture code comes into play. They want to buy, like in Germany, like you said, the ultimate driving machine or the ultimately engineered machine. Whereas in the States, it's just like, give me something big, fast, and powerful like a horse. And I don't think those equivalencies are actually wrong. I think they're actually right.
Yeah, so there's a book written about it, so I'm just quoting from it. But I think it adapts to a lot of different products, and fundamentally, what this tells is that people, when they buy something, they're looking for a particular emotion,
right?
And the emotion they're looking for is different depending on the local parameters, ecosystem, history.
So, do you think about this when you invest? So you're a hardware investor only? Is that too strong a word?
So. Maybe I should branch into that topic now.
Please.
So essentially what happened, I started working with startups because of my consulting work. So I had a team researching innovation across Japan, China, and Korea. And we're researching startups on the tech successes and ecosystems for clients all around the world. And I started to do some angel investments. Eventually, as I realized I really liked working with early stage founders, I realized that the consulting business wasn't going to be a good fit for that. And a friend of mine who had started a hardware accelerator, actually the first one in the world in Shenzhen, invited me to come and join and help out. And what I realized is that I had seen innovation ecosystems that many of them had been, as I mentioned, too isolated, and I had a really hard time crossing borders.
Okay.
But for the first time, here was an ecosystem that was globally relevant. It was kind of a secret garden of the big companies. They were already there. But what was new is that smaller companies could now tap into the ecosystem to get some of the same advantages of a fast turnaround, scaling from small to large. And this could be done even by companies where they had like 3 people on a prototype.
So you're talking about this whole supply chain ecosystem that exists in Shenzhen, right? All the sort of small things, the miniaturized components that make up essentially what's the mobile the mobile space. You can go into Shenzhen and buy all the same
Oh
products
yeah,
and
no,
combine it
it goes
yourself.
beyond. It's really, you can build any electronics you want,
Right.
like from a tiny little trinket to a big robot. And we've done it all. So far with Hacks, so that's the company I work with at the moment as a partner. We, for the past 4 years, we invested in over 200 companies from all around the world, US, Europe, Asia. We bring them to Shenzhen to accelerate their development. They leverage the supply chain. They learn how to do things fast and better. And they start to basically work with the same tools as the biggest companies in the world.
Right.
On a smaller scale initially, but it's an incredible advantage. And as we were working with the companies, we realized that building a product was just one problem. You needed first to make sure it had very strong positioning, strategic positioning. Then it had to be communicated right. And then you needed to learn how to launch it, to distribute it. So eventually we built our program into some kind of full stack support that would basically coach founders to do all of that.
Okay. Tell me more. That's really interesting. Can you walk me through, because it sounds to me like what you've done is you've said to people, look, there's a massive supply chain here for all the components you really need to build any hardware product. Like you said, from the smallest product to the most complex and biggest product. And all of these products can be used globally. But because anybody can build it, now you have to have a product that people know exists. You have to know how to market it properly. You have to know how to use the logistics around it, in other words, to get it from Shenzhen to the rest of the world, even though that does exist, but you have to know how to use it efficiently and properly. And you have to know how to continuously adapt, right, and evolve, which is what you were saying earlier, so that the new person that comes in doesn't out-execute you and out-innovate you using the newest components and stuff. So you've built, that's what Accelerator is, or Hacks is, right? You teach people how to do that. Yeah, you teach people how to do that.
I would say hardware is a bit different from software in that sense that there is more effort to build a physical product than typical software product.
Okay.
It's also a barrier of entry. So if you build something with enough technology in it, particularly on the software side, it's not that easy to replicate.
Not really.
So that's actually a competitive advantage.
Right.
But now, as you mentioned, it's not just about building it. It's about promoting it, selling it, making sure there's a real need for it. And so just to quote a few examples, we have... which ones could I quote? We've built, some of our companies built robots. One is a robot that does automated inventory in supermarkets. So they're already in Target and in a few other stores in the US. So it's just a robot, looks like basically, what does it look like? Like a chess piece, almost like a large chess piece. It rolls around the alleys, and it uses computer vision to scan automatically all the shelves and tell you what's there and what's not there, what's misplaced, mispriced, and everything.
Wow.
It does inventory in 30 minutes instead of 30 hours.
Right, and it doesn't get tired, and it doesn't take breaks for food or cigarettes.
Tired,
right?
And it's not. It just works. It's one of those robots, like basically relieving us of tedious, repetitive, or dangerous tasks.
Right.
So that's just one example. Another interesting company, so this one's called Symbia Robotics, based in Silicon Valley. Another one from Sweden is called Flow Neuroscience. It's a device that uses brain stimulation using low currents, low voltage and low intensity currents, a little bit like a 9-volt battery, to stimulate your brain to relieve the symptoms of depression. So essentially, that's a device that has the potential to basically compete and replace antidepressants.
Yep.
So it's one of those kind of new categories of digital therapies that are coming up. So we've done a lot of investments in health tech recently. We have a partnership with Johnson & Johnson that we signed last year.
Good for you.
And they help us on the regulatory side, on the customer insights. So those are the categories that we feel very excited about, is robotics, health tech, and we also have, of course, a lot of consumer devices. So our companies, so I mentioned we've done about 200 investments so far, and they have run over 80 campaigns successfully on Kickstarter. 11 of them have raised over $1 million.
Wow.
There's just about 100 projects in the world that raised $1 million.
On Kickstarter, right?
In technology.
Yep.
It's the variety. It's really like a really incredible moment. I think we're living in technology, because you might have felt that when you saw like mobile booming in Japan, or online games booming in Korea, and the various internet waves. But with devices, it's really spreading to the physical world, and it's changing things.
Yeah,
so it's a really very unique moment.
It's super unique. I mean, and again, you know this way better than I do, right? But in my mind, and I think in most consumers' mind, they'll know at least the name of this one company called Xiaomi, right? And this company was impossible to found and to grow at the speed with which it did both of those things without that supply chain and that electronic space that you're talking about, and manufacturing base in Shenzhen. Is that not true? So this company was founded in
absolutely
2010,
yes.
And it came out of nowhere because it had all the components there, and it marketed well, it built products, it did all those things that you were talking about. It almost seems like it was accelerated by you. No, but you know what I mean? Like,
I wish
we
were not around at the time, and also the founder is a very special guy. He had already like built a company and done quite a few things, so he could bootstrap it with quite a few millions.
Yeah, but you understand the point is that he couldn't have done that otherwise.
Xiaomi is an interesting company because it's a smartphone company that has a very strong software component, and they were very good at software. But essentially, the innovation was around business model and distribution.
Correct.
Among other companies that really changed the game and are coming from China is DJI, the drone companies.
Yep.
Today, the world's biggest consumer drone company. And more recently, there's a couple of companies based in China called Ofo and Mobike that do the bike rental, dockless bike rental company. And those guys are less than 3 years old, and they already have millions of bikes deployed, and it's all, connected, smart. And it's incredible. Like, those companies are 3 years old. They're like multi-unicorns, and it's not clear how good of a business that's going to be eventually, but in terms of scaling and deployment, it's unbelievable.
Right. I was going to ask you. So, as you know, I follow all these spaces. I follow hardware less than I follow software. For no particular reason, but only maybe because I'm in a place where it's easier to develop software than it is to develop hardware, and hardware is uniquely available, like you said, in Shenzhen and in China. And again, it's this whole concept of, do they have any special ability there, or did it all just start growing up there, and then it all concentrates there, kind of similar to what happened in Silicon Valley in the United States, right? Like, you couldn't recreate Shenzhen anywhere, even if you put all those components together, I think, or it would be really hard. But I wonder sometimes, you go back and forth to China and Hong Kong all the time, right? So I watch these companies like Ofo and Mobike, and I just wonder, like, I get it. I understand the way that works, and I understand it's digitized and connected and all those other things. So I just wonder what the end value is for the bicycle.
Yeah. Well, you have a few questions into this one question.
Sorry.
So the question about Shenzhen, actually, Shenzhen is just a shorthand to talk about the electronic supply chain.
Sure.
I'm not sure that the bikes themselves, which is basically like, metal tubes on tires,
they're separate.
I don't think they're made in Shenzhen, or even in maybe not even in Guangdong. It doesn't matter. But the electronics are probably made in Shenzhen.
Sure.
What's amazing about China is that China makes everything.
Yeah.
It makes TVs, bicycles, fridges, smartphones, iPhones, everything. And every time you buy a product that is partly made in China, in a way you're investing in the supply chain there and the capabilities there.
Absolutely.
So now there's so much know-how and so much production capability that they can just make anything at any scale. And so that's what companies like Mobike and Ofo leverage. So they design themselves, redesign the bike for sharing and renting. And imagine those bikes travel a lot, right? They're used all day long, so they have to be really pretty reliable. And they combine everything moves very fast. Like, the whole China moves at startup speed. You make the electronics somewhere, you make the frame somewhere else, you make the tires somewhere else, you assemble somewhere, and then you can deploy. Now the question so just because of that, and because every time anybody in the world buys something partly made in China, they invest in that ecosystem. That's something that's been going on for over 30 years.
Right.
You're not going to replicate it overnight.
No.
It's not a matter of putting one factory somewhere on a bunch of robots or a bunch of people.
No way.
It just doesn't work. The jobs that are going to come back to America, I believe, because that's a kind of big topic over there, are mostly assembly jobs, which are the first ones that America actually outsourced. And now they're going to bring that back because it's going to be more convenient to assemble some of the things domestically. But those are really low-skilled jobs. They're not very desirable jobs. And then there's going to be some robots that are going to do very high-tech stuff. And then there's going to be maybe some micro factories that don't need to rely so much on the global supply chain to actually make things.
Right.
So maybe like the next phases of 3D printing. So this is what's going to happen. You're not going to have a huge supply chain going to come back to America anytime soon. It's going to be really difficult.
It's going to be really difficult.
The only way that could happen would be when you have a giant company that decides to build a factory and brings their, supply ecosystem around them, like automotive manufacturers, for example. But that's a very specialized supply chain.
It is.
So that's not going to be lifting really manufacturing capabilities on the broader scale.
Right. So you talk about
that's one thing.
You're talking about two secular changes. You're talking about they're coming into contention with each other. And I'm just sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, I completely agree with you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Now you had the question about what's the end game for bicycles.
Yeah.
Frankly, I haven't seen the numbers. I don't know. To me, it's kind of I say that as a joke, but I think it's a marketing scheme for mobile payments. It's to help spread mobile payment.
How does that work? I did not make that connection. So how does that work?
Well, because you need a mobile payment account to be able to rent. You need like Alipay or WeChat Pay, and that's how you rent those bikes. So those bikes are actually, in a way, one of the killer apps for payment.
Got it. So you're saying that's a customer acquisition scheme for payment companies.
It could be. The fact that the payment companies are shareholders of those bike companies is an indication, but it cannot be the real end game because that wouldn't make sense.
Nope.
And I just don't know. Interestingly, I'm in Paris at the moment, and Paris was the first city to actually deploy city bikes. It was a consequence of some kind of a citywide advertising deal, and the advertiser said, "Okay, well, we want to keep the deal we have with the city, and we, as a matter of goodwill, we'll provide a bike rental service." So we have this service called Velib that since then expanded to electric cars, and recently there's even electric scooters rental by different companies. But this is a hugely popular service in France, in Paris.
Right.
And I'm not. I think it's potentially profitable. I'm not sure, but because it was a side kind of goodwill branding thing by an advertising company, out of home, like outdoor advertising company. So maybe offer on mobile car like that. Maybe it's not. Maybe the fact that they have this kind of daily touch points can provide also a competitive advantage or a channel to sell things to people. Because just imagine if people use your app like 10 times a week, it's actually quite unique. So there's ways, and you know what they are physically. So there's maybe some business models to deploy there. I'm not sure if the pure rental model is enough to make those companies profitable, but I guess the founders either calculated those numbers or have a bigger plan.
That is the most interesting explanation I've had for those bike companies. So they're basically payment-based but location-based, right, services that you can build other things on top of. If you think about it, if those bikes are connected, they're actually building their own network, for lack of a better term. And if you can build services on top of that network for people that are using those bikes, whether it's advertising for location-based things, or even just build up your payments, and then you have a dedicated client or a captive client for your payment system, you can then serve them other services that they'll then pay for as well. It's really interesting, right?
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably get the answers within a few years. I don't know how soon, but it's interesting to look at, and there's definitely a good service to provide to cities.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to the extent that it has clean energy associated with it and just, clean moving around, there's nothing wrong with having bicycles. There are some cities where it won't work. It's almost impossible to ride a bicycle in Bangkok, but it's not so hard to ride a bicycle in Chiang Mai or in Phuket and other big cities in Thailand. Mm-hmm. And Singapore's the same way. And Tokyo, frankly, would be an awesome place for this because it's just so safe to ride. I used to ride my bicycle there all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's it's interesting. And what's interesting in particular is that, in a way, this model is not new.
No.
But what's amazing is the scale and the speed at which it could be deployed in China.
Right.
Is really quite amazing.
Yeah, and I guess that's the other thing to learn and to garner from this is that the ability for these companies in China to scale in what essentially feels like overnight, right? Like you said earlier, internet time, which is not a phrase that a lot of people use anymore, but you're really right, though. To scale that fast is one of the unique abilities that China has, because it has the ability to build things fast. It has the software knowledge, but it also has the scale, right? You talked about market size before. It also has the market size, too. So you could come up with this company in Singapore. It could never scale this fast because it just doesn't have the inherent market size to be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, actually in Singapore, interestingly, there's one bike rental company that is less than 1 year old and that just raised several tens of millions just recently. So of course, they're not just a Singapore play. They have already started to expand internationally. So it's interesting how you can learn from other markets, adapt some ideas, try to find other target geographies, and it's quite interesting. Like the most interesting is actually to realize that the more developed markets sometimes have a hard time creating startups and scaling them because of the legacy of their infrastructure or their regulations.
Agreed completely.
Yeah, today, there's a lot of explanations for it, but today in Japan and Korea, there's probably less startups that you can find in Indonesia, India, or China.
There are fewer market gaps, right? So, and everything that does have a market gap already has a regulator associated with it, so it's harder to come up with something innovative because every time you do, someone tries to get in your way because you're taking away a legacy business from somebody else. Again, just like Uber faced the problems in New York and in Chicago and in Miami and places where the taxi companies were well entrenched, right?
Because you're displacing people who have entrenched interest. It's very difficult. Another thing that maybe I'd like to mention in this interview is when people look at, how can we encourage startups and entrepreneurship? I think it's a kind of interesting topic, and I get asked that a lot by people from Japan in particular. And eventually, like my initial analysis of the ecosystem was like, okay, there's something. It's not about problem of infrastructure, capital, or talent, or market size. It's really about some kind of cultural thing. But what does that mean? And because it's too easy to say, Japanese are risk averse. It doesn't really answer anything. It doesn't really help you understand. It doesn't help you change. So what is being risk averse? Or why would they be risk averse? And that's where I dived into it. And the most recent kind of epiphany was that it's not about how successful you can be. It's about what does it cost you to fail?
Right.
And in Japan, there's very few safety nets for entrepreneurs.
Well, none really.
In US, the talent circulates very fast. So if you're capable, if your company fails, it doesn't. I mean, of course, you're going to be disappointed, but you're not going to be personally bankrupt. You're going to find a job very easily,
right? And
your experience will be valued. Whereas in Japan, if you fail a startup, you cannot go back to your previous job. You probably don't have any insurance or unemployment coverage. Your experience might be detrimental to future jobs. So it's a very punitive, actually, and there's no regulatory or ecosystem-based safety nets for entrepreneurs. And considering that the general result of a startup is failure, and that you need generally a few experiences to learn enough. Like I gave the example of Wang Xin on the Groupon of China, Meituan. He failed 4 companies before being vastly successful. It took him almost a decade.
Right.
But if he had given up after the first one and had gone back to whatever job, he would never be there. And of course, every time you do something, you learn something. And because of the intensity of the entrepreneurial experience, you learn very fast and you learn very painfully. And actually, you could say the more painful lessons are the ones you learn best.
Right.
So essentially, when you look at ecosystem, it's really important to understand what are the safety nets and what are the downsides of failure. I heard that even even now, maybe in Korea, if your company fails, you're personally liable.
Right.
It's pretty dangerous. Limited liability company is arguably one of the most important inventions in corporate structures that made, all those even crazy like international travels of people who are sending ships to China or India or America viable was that they were not personally liable.
Right.
So there's all those ecosystem parameters and regulatory parameters that can be changed to encourage entrepreneurship. And again, I'm going to use the example of France because until 5 years ago, France wasn't really a very entrepreneurial country. It was actually had a lot of similarities to Japan and other places that were quite established, very conservative. But and that despite some regulatory advantages, like you can take a sabbatical for a year or two from your company to do whatever you want pretty much, and then go back to your job by law. They have to take you back. And if you start a company, there's even regulation that says that you get unemployment benefits until your new income is equivalent to what you would get from unemployment benefits, what you're entitled to.
Interesting.
So those are like regulatory safety nets. But really what changed everything in the past 5 years is that big companies started to realize that they couldn't invent everything. They started to look around and they realized that there's all those startups inventing all sorts of things and they need to connect with what they call like open innovation or outside innovation. And that if they wanted to make that connection, they needed people who actually knew that world and that internally they didn't have them.
Right.
So they started to hire people with startup experience, and they were even happier if those people
had failed.
Used to actually work at their company because they knew both sides.
Right.
So suddenly, the people with startup experience or the people who had left a big company were valued. And that's basically changed everything, because that means that, okay, your startup doesn't work, you can find a new job, and you'll be appreciated for what you bring and the bridge you bring to those big companies. So I think this is a really big game changer, and I haven't seen that happen in Japan yet.
No.
I had conversations recently with some guys on there was a group of visitors from Japan to our office, and I asked them, okay, so if you quit your job, can you get it back after you do a startup? And so there was one guy from Sony, and I asked him, hey, what happens at Sony if you quit your job? Can you go back? Yeah. And he said, well, maybe at Sony. that was about it.
Maybe. That's not encouraging. No, it's not super.
Sony.
It's not super encouraging for everybody else, right?
It's not. And so, of course, if you're today, there's enough of software companies to hire you. I mean, in many cases, to hire you back or to find jobs. But if you come from a more traditional type of businesses, not everybody's a software engineer. Like we work with hardware companies. They come from electronics companies, automotive companies, and a lot of different walks of life. They're not going to be, becoming a software engineer. They have different skill set.
Right.
And that's a much broader skill set generally. So it's, I think this is really key to encourage entrepreneurship is about it's not about the upside. It's about what's the downside and can you reduce the downside?
Right. So this is what I want to leave people with, because I think this is actually the perfect place to end this conversation, and I'll tell you why. Because I think it leads to an entire other episode for us to talk about what does it cost to fail, and how do you change, and because I really want to talk about this more, but we've already been talking for an hour, and I don't want to take up any more of your time, right? But I think this concept of what does it cost to fail is actually really important. And like I said, it's a perfect segue into what I hope will be our next conversation, because it matters. That's what's really going to drive. If the math and the calculus around failure is so skewed towards destruction and personal ruin, and the chances of success we know are, let's say, 1 in 7 or 1 in 8, then your desire or your likelihood to actually take that risk and fail is just much lower. But if there is some kind of safety net, it doesn't have to be the government or anything like that. There just has to be some way to not die. That's maybe institutional or maybe just cultural, whatever it is. But I think it brings up another entire show, and hopefully we can go over that. But I love this concept of what does it cost to fail, and I think it's just the perfect place.
It's funny enough that it really took me quite a few years to to really kind of break it down and try to understand what were the parameters that could, reduce the penalty.
Right.
And I agree that it's an important conversation because it's something that can really change entire ecosystems in a way once there is this realization, because almost nothing else can be changed fast.
Right. Okay. Well, look, I really want to thank you so much, Benjamin, for getting on the phone on vacation in Paris, or at least just on a working vacation in Paris. I don't think any of us ever stop working, right? To be fair. I'm sure
That's
you're getting
true.
if you're invested in 200 companies, I'm sure you're getting calls all the time. I really want to thank you. So Benjamin Joffe, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And like I said earlier, hopefully you'll come back again and talk to us some more, because I do want to get deeper into this idea of what does it cost to fail.
With great pleasure. So thanks a lot, Michael.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.